the Fine Hominy Story. Once upon a time there was a farmhouse, and it was painted white and had green blinds, and it stood not far from the road, and in the fence was a wide gate to let the wagons through to the barn, and the wagons, going through, had made a track that led up past the kitchen door, and past the shed, and past the barn, and past the orchard to the wheat field. Not far from the house there was a field where corn grew, and when the winter was over and the snow was gone and it was beginning to get warm, Uncle John got the old oxen out of the barn, and the oxen put their heads down, and Uncle John put the yoke over and the bows over, and he put the plough on the drag and hooked the drag chain to the yoke. Then he said, "Gee up there, Buck, gee up there, Star." So the old oxen started walking slowly along the wagon track and out of the gate into the road. Uncle Solomon and Uncle John walked along beside them, and Little John walked behind, and they walked along until they came to the cornfield. Then the oxen stopped, and Uncle John took the bars down out of the holes in the posts, and the oxen geed up again through the gate into the cornfield. Then Uncle John unhooked the chain from the drag and hooked it to the plough and said, "Gee up!" again, and the oxen started walking across the field, dragging the plough. Uncle Solomon held the handles, and the plough dug into the ground and turned up the dirt into a great heap on one side and left a deep furrow, a kind of long hollow, all across the field where it had gone. And the old oxen walked across the field, around and around, making the furrow and turning up the dirt, until they had been all over the field. Then Uncle John unhooked the chain from the plough and hooked it onto the harrow. The harrow is a big kind of a frame that has diggers like little ploughs sticking down all over the underside of it, and the oxen dragged the harrow over the field, and the little teeth broke up the lumps of dirt and smoothed it over and made it soft so that the seeds could grow. Then Uncle John unhooked the chain from the harrow and hooked it to the drag and put the plough on the drag and said, "Gee up!" And the oxen walked along through the gateway and along the road until they came to the farmhouse. And they went in at the wide gate and up the wagon track until they came to the shed, and there they stopped. Then Uncle John unhooked the chain and took off the yoke, and the old oxen went into the barn and went to sleep, and Uncle John put the drag in the shed. The next day Uncle John took a great bag full of corn and put it over his shoulder and started walking along to the cornfield, and Little John walked behind. And when they got to the cornfield, Uncle John put the great bag of corn on the ground and put some in a little bag and gave it to Little John. Then Uncle John began walking across the field, and Little John walked behind. And at every step Uncle John stopped and made 5 little holes in the ground, and then he took another step and made 5 other little holes, and Little John came after, and he put 1 grain of corn in each hole and brushed the dirt over, and they went all over the field, putting the corn in the ground, and when it was all covered over, they went away and left it. Then the rain came and fell on the field and sank into the ground, and the sun shone and warmed it, and the corn began to grow, and soon the little green blades pushed through the ground like grass, and got bigger and bigger and taller, until when the summer was almost over, they were great cornstalks as high as Uncle John's head, and on each stalk were the ears of corn wrapped up tight in green leaves, and at the top was the tassel that waved about. Then, when the tassel got yellow and brown and the leaves began to dry up, Uncle John knew it was time to gather the corn, for it was ripe. Then Uncle Solomon and Uncle John came out with great, heavy, sharp knives and cut down all the corn stalks and pulled the ears of corn off the stalks. And Little John came and helped pull off the leaves from around the ears. Then the old oxen came out of the barn, and Uncle John put the yoke over their necks and the bows up under and hooked the tongue of the ox cart to the yoke. And he said, "Gee up there!" And the old oxen began walking slowly along, dragging the cart, and they went out the wide gate and along the road to the cornfield. Then Uncle John and Uncle Solomon tossed the ears of corn into the cart, and when it was full, the old oxen started again, walking slowly along back to the farmhouse, in through the wide gate, and up the wagon track, and in at the wide door of the barn. And Uncle John put all the ears of corn into a kind of pen in the barn, and the old oxen dragged the cart back to the cornfield to get it filled again, and so they did, until all the ears of corn were in the pen. And then Uncle John unhooked the tongue of the cart, and put the cart in the shed, and he took off the yoke, and the oxen went into the barn and went to sleep. The next morning, Uncle Solomon and Uncle John and Little John all went out to the barn and sat on little stools, low stools with 3 legs, that they sit on when they milk the cows, and rub the kernels of corn off the cobs. Then Uncle John put all the corn into bags and put it away, and he put the cobs in the shed to use in making fires. Then one morning Uncle John got out the oxen, and they put their heads down, and he put the yoke over their necks and the bows up under, and he hooked the tongue of the ox cart to the yoke, and he said, "Gee up there!" And they walked into the barn. Then Uncle John put all the bags of corn into the cart, and he put Little John up on the cart, and the old oxen started again and walked slowly along, down the wagon track, out the wide gate, and into the road. Then they turned along the road, not the way to the field where they got the water, but the other way, and they walked a long way, until they came to a place where there was a building besides a little river, and on the outside of the building was a great, enormous wheel, so big that it reached down and dipped into the water. And when the water in the little river flowed along, it made the great wheel turn around, and this made a great heavy stone inside the building turn around on top of another stone. Now, the building is called a mill, and the big wheel outside is called a mill wheel, and the stones are called millstones, and the man that takes care of the mill is called the miller. Now the miller was sitting in the doorway of the mill, and when he saw Uncle John and Little John and the ox cart filled with bags, he got up and came out and called to Uncle John, "Good morning. What can I do for you this morning?" And Uncle John said, "I've got some corn to grind." So the oxen stopped, and Little John got down, and the miller and Uncle John took all the bags of corn into the mill, and the oxen lay down and went to sleep. Then Uncle John and Little John sat down on some logs in the mill, and the miller asked Uncle John how he wanted the corn ground. So Uncle John said he wanted some of it just cracked, and some of it ground into fine hominy, and some of it into meal. Then the miller fixed the stones so they would just crack the corn, and he poured the corn in at a place where it would run between the stones, and he started the stone turning. When the corn was cracked, he put it into the bags again and tied them up. Then he fixed the stones so that they would grind the corn into fine hominy, and he poured the corn in, and it came out ground into fine hominy. Then he put the fine hominy into the bags again and tied them up. Then he fixed the stones so that they would grind the corn into meal, and he poured the corn in, and it came out ground into meal. Then he put the meal into the bags again and tied them up. And the miller kept 2 bags of each kind to pay for grinding the corn, but the other bags he put into the ox cart. Then the oxen got up, and Little John was lifted up, and the old oxen started walking slowly along home again. And they walked a long time until they came to the wide gate, and they turned in at the gate and up the wagon track to the kitchen door, and there they stopped, and Uncle John took one of the bags of meal into the kitchen and gave it to Aunt Deborah. And he said, "Here's your meal, Deborah." And Aunt Deborah said, "All right, I'll make some johnny cake for breakfast tomorrow." And the rest of the meal was put away in the storeroom until they wanted it, for they had enough to last them all winter and some to take to market besides. And Uncle John unhooked the tongue of the cart from the yoke and put the cart in the shed, and he took off the yoke, and the old oxen went into the barn and went to sleep. And that's all.